Trump is once again claiming that the war is almost over in Iran, but he's also sending thousands more troops to the Middle East. And as his blockade takes effect in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's threatening retaliation that could send energy prices spiraling even further, netting oil companies billions more on top of the profits that have already been staggering, according to a new analysis. But let's start with the latest deployment of American service members to the region, because that number is reportedly around 10,000, with that including 6,000 troops aboard the USS George HW Bush, which along with several warships escorting the carrier are expected to arrive as a 2-week ceasefire set to expire on April 22nd. And then another 4,200 Marines are expected to arrive near the end of the month. And so that would bring the total number of troops in the region to around 60,000, while the total number of aircraft carriers deployed would be 3, each with dozens of fighter jets accompanied by several warships. And this continued buildup of American military forces in the region, it's meant to ramp up the pressure on Iran to agree to the White House's terms for a peace deal. But, for that to work, of course, Iran has to actually believe that the US would consider putting those troops to use. And while the Trump administration, they're reportedly considering the possibility of additional strikes or ground operations if the current ceasefire doesn't hold and a deal isn't reached. Now, when it comes to ground operations, as we've talked about, the administration's discussed everything from going after Iran's uranium to seizing Karg Island to landing Marines on other key islands and coastal areas in order to reclaim the strait. And having a greater presence in the region would also give the military more flexibility. And with that, you had a retired Navy admiral who's now dean at the Center for Maritime Strategy telling the Washington Post, the more tools you have got in your kit, the more diversity of options that you have, with him then calling the new forces arriving a reserve capacity in the event that things go south. You've also had the White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying in a statement that Trump has wisely kept all options on the table in the event that the Iranians will not forego their nuclear ambitions and make a deal that is acceptable to the United States. Though with that, Iran has long said that it has no intention of building a nuclear weapon. In fact, the country's previous supreme leader issued what's known as a fatwa against building one, and American intelligence assessments have consistently said that before the war began, Iran had been undecided over whether to pursue one. That is, unless its enrichment sites were attacked or its supreme leader was killed. But also, despite the fact that the US and Israel have now crossed both of those lines, the country's current leaders still seem willing at least to say that they won't build a bomb. They just say that they don't want to give up their civilian nuclear program, which they've used in the past to enrich uranium to levels beyond what it's needed for any civilian purpose. But in any case, talks between the two sides reportedly fell apart this weekend, in large part due to Iran's rejection of the administration's demand that it suspend all nuclear activity for 20 years. Because Iran, they're apparently only willing to agree to 5 right now. Though also, as we've talked about, any deal letting Iran get back to enrichment at some point in the future could be seen as a failure by Trump to live up to his promise to keep the country from ever being able to have a nuclear weapon. And it would make whatever deal he gets closer to the 2015 deal that was negotiated under Obama, which he withdrew the United States from and repeatedly dismissed as one of the worst deals ever made. Right, and then after the news broke about his negotiating team's request for a 20-year suspension, he told the New York Post that he wasn't happy with that offer, saying, "I've been saying they can't have nuclear weapons, so I don't like the 20 years. I don't want them to feel like they have a win." Of course, as anyone who's kind of lived long enough to see it, successful negotiating is often letting both sides feel like they got a win, at least in some way. No one's ever fully happy. But that's also an especially big ask with Trump, and with that, you had a former Secretary of the US Army who now heads the Nuclear Threat Initiative explaining, a big challenge for the administration is that for the Iranians, their nuclear program has been so central to their cause for so many years. It's part of the whole regime identity, a source of national pride, and it's been held up as one of the reasons why the public has to endure economic privation. And then with that, she added, the concern she has had since the latest war began is that the administration's pressure will convince the Iranians of the necessity to rush for a bomb. But then, with all this, and maybe despite all of that, Trump on Fox Business said that he thought that the war in Iran is very close to over, and then added,
"If I pulled up stakes right now, it would take them 20 years to rebuild that country. And we're not finished. We'll see what happens. I think they want to make a deal very badly."
Trump also re-upped his threats to perpetrate what experts say would just be war crimes with attacks on Iranian civilian infrastructure.
"We could take out every one of their bridges in 1 hour. We could take out every one of their power plants, electric power plants, in 1 hour."
The main way that the US is applying pressure right now actually appears to be Trump's blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, where you had US Central Command saying yesterday that more than 10,000 US sailors, Marines, and airmen, along with over a dozen warships and dozens of aircraft, are involved in the blockade, and then also claiming that American forces had already confronted 6 merchant vessels departing an Iranian port and forced them to turn back. And notably with that, according to officials, none of those 6 encounters required the use of force. And they clarified that the blockade only applies to ships that were in an Iranian port or pulled into one after 10 a.m. Eastern time on Monday, which explains why 2 ships that had been in Iranian ports before then were allowed to pass after the blockade went into effect. You also had one official explaining to the Washington Post that American naval forces enforcing the blockade aren't hanging around Iranian ports or in the Strait of Hormuz itself, instead saying, "Our net is the Gulf of Oman. There's one way in and one way out. We've got the whole thing on lockdown." And then later last night, you had CENTCOM's commander saying in a statement that the blockade has been fully implemented, and adding an estimated 90% of Iran's economy is fueled by international trade by sea, and claiming that in less than 36 hours since the blockade was implemented, US forces have completely halted economic trade going into and out of Iran by sea. Though also, at the same time, more than a dozen ships without links to Iran moved through the strait on Monday and Tuesday, according to a maritime tracking company. But also now, you have Iran threatening to clamp down on trade again, not just in the Strait of Hormuz, but elsewhere. With the head of Joint Military Command that oversees the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Army claiming that if the blockade creates insecurity for Iran's commercial and oil vessels, they will consider it a prelude to violating the ceasefire, and adding, Iran's powerful armed forces will not allow any exports or imports to continue in the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea. And while that sounds so alarming to most people, there are also some who are rubbing their hands together and licking their lips. I'm talking about the people who make money when oil prices go up. And I especially wanted to hit on that because of a new analysis from The Guardian that's really put into perspective just how much money we're talking about. Reportedly, the world's top 100 oil and gas companies banked more than $30 million every hour in unearned profit in the first month of the US-Israeli war in Iran. And if the price for a barrel of oil continues to average around $100, they will collectively make an extra $234 billion by the end of the year. And those profits, they come as ordinary people are paying more and more just to fill up their tanks and power their homes. And in fact, all of this, it's led to dozens of countries cutting fuel taxes to help struggling consumers, meaning that these governments are also now raising less money for public services. And this has actually led to the finance ministers of Germany, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Austria to ask the European Commission to implement a new windfall tax on energy profits, writing in a joint letter. It would make it possible to finance temporary relief, especially for consumers, and curb rising inflation without placing additional burdens on public budgets, and adding, it would also send a clear message that those who profit from the consequences of the war must do their part to ease the burden on the general public. Though also with this, you have others arguing that everything that we're seeing right now, it's clear evidence of the need to move away from oil and gas and to invest in renewables. Or you have the head of investigations at Global Witness, which was involved in the analysis, saying, moments of global crisis continue to translate into bumper profits for oil majors while ordinary people pay the price. Until governments kick their fossil fuel addiction, all of our spending power will be held hostage to the whims of strongmen. And actually on the subject of strongmen, I'll point out one in particular, Vladimir Putin. Right? Because among the companies that may make the most money out of all this, 3 are from Russia. And they reportedly stand to make an estimated $23.9 billion in Iran-related war profits by the end of the year. And that's as Russia already earned $840 million a day from oil exports in March. That's 50% more than in February. But then, to get back to the US war with Iran, there are reports of progress in talks between the two sides, which are currently being facilitated by Pakistani, Egyptian, and Turkish mediators. And you had one US official telling Axios that Trump's negotiating team continued making calls and exchanging draft proposals with Iranians and mediators yesterday. And you had another claiming, we want to make a deal, and parts of their government want to make a deal. Now the trick is to get the whole of government over there to make the deal. And with that, a new round of direct in-person talks are expected to take place at some point before the ceasefire expires, but it's not yet clear exactly when. And these talks would likely only land some kind of framework agreement at best, which would then require an extension of the ceasefire so a more long-lasting deal could be made. And then also, speaking of ceasefires, we're now surprisingly seeing reports that Israel is considering a short-term ceasefire in Lebanon, or with the country's high-level security cabinet reportedly set to discuss the possibility when it meets tonight. And this, of course, is coming after the two sides met for historic talks in Washington, D.C. yesterday. And so for now, we're gonna have to wait to see if anything comes from either of these separate but connected negotiations.